As a property investor, you know that there's a time to buy and a time to sell. That's true even with rentals, where buying and letting sit to collect rent is the norm. Whether it's due to a change in life circumstances, goals, investment strategy, or you're doing a 1031 exchange to purchase a new rental, selling rental property can be tricky. You've got to contend with navigating ongoing lease terms, potential repairs, tax rules, and more, not to mention the work that goes into advertising and selling the property. Now, just a disclaimer, if you need specific legal advice, consider speaking to a lawyer or a real estate manager to answer any questions you may have. Let's first talk about how to actually properly sell a rental property. If you have a current lease going with a tenant, you need to go about things in one of a few specific ways so you don't break local rental laws. But don't fear, you've got options. And stick around later, as we'll also be going over how to avoid capital gains taxes from the sale of the property as well. Now, if you have an ongoing lease with a tenant, you can't just up and sell your property unless you have an early termination clause. If you don't have that within your lease, there is no easy option. That may be disappointing, but fortunately, there are still a few ways you can sell the property. The 4 main methods you can use to sell your rental property include paying your tenant to vacate. When you're looking to sell a property that has an active lease, the most crucial thing is you need to do something with the lease itself. Your first option is to encourage your tenant to leave the property by offering to pay, but how exactly does that work? You negotiate a settlement with tenants where you pay part or all of their moving costs. In exchange, they agree to exit their lease so you can sell the property. Be sure to consider these costs before calculating how much to offer. The security deposit, the most obvious expense. The security deposit is the main thing you should offer to pay for. A rent increase. You could offer to pay the difference in rent for an equivalent number of months as is remaining on their lease. For example, if they're currently paying you $1,200, but the property they choose is $1,350, you'd be doing $150 times the number of months left on their lease. And then there's moving expenses. Will they need to pay for a moving truck? What about movers? You can offer to cover this expense as well, which typically is a fraction of the above-mentioned expenses, but serves to be an attractive benefit nonetheless. Keep in mind, though, that these combined costs can become steep. Make sure you know in advance how much you're comfortable offering as an incentive to encourage your tenant to move so you don't go beyond it. Now let's talk about method number 2. Waiting until the lease expires. This is arguably the simplest but often least preferable option. In this scenario, you'd simply wait out the lease and properly notify your tenants of your intent to sell so they're aware in advance. Now, this likely isn't the option you want to use, especially if you just started or are in the middle of a lease term. However, every other option on this list takes either extra effort or money. So the main question you need to ask yourself is which of these things you're more willing to give and give up: time, effort, or money. Just keep in mind that waiting to sell could also cost you money, given the market could change from now until then. And then there's method number 3, finding a buyer to purchase the property and the lease. This is another viable option, especially for those looking to save cash and time. Where the first option costs money and the second option time, this option is more effort-based. However, it's not necessarily fast, since you're strictly looking for investors interested in buying who are also willing to take on a lease and existing tenants. It will take time to find a buyer willing to take over your lease, with no guarantee you'll find one before the lease is up. However, if you put your documents together right and can show that the property has a lot of opportunity, you could find a buyer relatively quickly. And finally, there's option number 4, sell to your tenant. This option is the rarest and least likely, since the tenant needs to have an interest in purchasing the property and be in a financial position to do so. Having said this, if those two things align, it can be a great option for both you and your tenant, as it means they don't have to go through the trouble of moving and you don't have to look for a buyer. Now, if your tenant has been great and you've loved working with them, that's a good sign to consider this option. Chances are they've been responsible with their greater financial situation if they've been responsible with rent. Plus, having had a positive experience living at the property, they'll be likely to consider purchasing it. As a last but important note, no matter which option you decide to go with, make sure to double check your state's rental and tenant specific laws to make sure you're following all necessary guidelines. So now that you have a better idea of the routes you can go to sell your property, let's talk about steps to take before selling. Identifying your target buyer is the first and most important step, but there are a few more you can take to smoothen the process, especially if this is your first time selling a property. They include, number 1, getting a pre-listing inspection. A pre-listing inspection is simply an inspection you complete before listing the property. It's useful because it allows to accurately estimate the value of the property while also ensuring the purchase goes smoothly. That's because you'll already have caught any potential repairs ahead of time. Number 2, complete repairs. You could put these off until the purchase inspection and see what your buyers want, but it's generally best to get these done beforehand. This helps your property to look better to potential buyers who don't think like investors or flippers. They don't want to have to deal with repairs the moment they purchase the property unless they're going in wanting a fixer-upper. Number 3, setting a price. Now, with inspection in hand, consider how you've chosen to sell the property to decide on a price. You'll typically be able to get more from an investor with an existing tenant, as they'll be immediately able to collect rent. On the other hand, a standard sale or one to your tenant should usually be set at a comparable price to recent sales nearby of similar properties, like usual. Either way, it's important to know how much you should be charging so you can get the most from the sale while also ensuring the sale doesn't take longer than expected due to overpricing. Number 4, communicate with your tenant. Let your team know in advance that you've decided to sell and are preparing to show the property. Make sure they understand exactly what is going to happen depending on how you're selling it. For example, if you're selling to an investor and transferring the lease, explain how their lease and security deposit are going to transfer to the new owner and reassure them that the process will be smooth. Also, make sure to work with them as much as possible during showings by finding days and times that work best for them while intruding as little as possible. When you sell a rental property, it's important to understand the potential tax consequences. Paying taxes on the sale of a property isn't surprising, but the potentially hefty capital gains taxes you often pay when selling a rental property can be. That's because the sale of a rental property is much different than that of the sale of a primary residence. When you sell a primary residence, a property of which you've lived in for 2 of the past 5 years typically, you don't usually pay taxes on the sale up to a certain amount. However, if selling an investment property, you'll pay capital gains tax on the property's growth. How much you pay typically depends on how long you've owned the property. If you've owned the property for 1 year or less, you'll usually pay short-term capital gains tax at a rate somewhere between 10 to 37%. If you've owned the property for more than 1 year, you'll pay anywhere from 15 to 20% unless your taxable income is below a certain threshold. So then, what are your options? There are a few, but the one most often used and most accessible is a 1031 exchange. A 1031 exchange allows you to defer capital gains tax on an investment property, making it the perfect tool when selling your rental property. The only caveat to that is that you need to intend to use the proceeds from the sale for further investing. With a 1031 exchange, you're able to avoid paying capital gains tax by essentially exchanging one property for another. Now, if you're trying to exit a rental property and use the funds for another venture or simply to cash out, this isn't an option. However, it's great if you're trying to shift from one neighborhood or property to another potentially profitable one. Now, keep in mind, the main requirement of a 1031 exchange is that it must be a like-kind property. In other words, the property you intend to purchase needs to be similar in certain ways to the one you want to buy. For example, you can't exchange a rental property for one you intend to be your primary residence. There's more to it, but basically you'll want to exchange the property for another of similar or lesser value for the same purpose. In this case, a rental property. So let's wrap this up. When it comes to selling a rental property with an active lease, there is no easy way out. However, if you're aware of the tools available to you, the process becomes much easier and more profitable. Well, that's it for this video. If you want more real estate content for your business, make sure you check out our YouTube channel for more DoorLoop videos such as can landlords charge tenants for carpet cleaning and damages, and what is appraised value? Everything you need to know. Remember to like this video, share it, and of course, subscribe to our channel.